These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Radical Histories and Liberation in Kenya with Waringa Wahome, Part 1. Africa World Now Project is next. In Mau Mau Nationhood, the editors write, "New states are often declared in the name of peoples not yet aware of their own collective existence. Their heroically unified past and manifest joint destiny have yet to be imagined for them. National imagination follows the state. After a new state's formation, its schools can teach a standard language. Its sergeant majors can shout it to conscripts on parade grounds. Peasants can thus be turned into citizens. Invented common festivals and subsequent long histories of political compromise may together combine, but not always, to create a patriot culture with a past to be proud of. The myths, the origin stories, the narratives of a real and imagined collective identity are pieced together as a product of historical experiences of a people who came to dominate the structures of the newly formed state. Its implementation, its functions are guided by a philosophical structure developed and redeveloped that demands the consent of the masses to give legitimacy to the rights of the ruling class. Rights from which all conceptualizations of law and politics henceforth narrowly applied and often stripped from the lower classes." Accordingly, the editors of Mau Mau Nationhood go on to write, "No nation is born without having to face up to questions about who is included, whom is excluded, about how equal the rights of citizenship can be in practice, what degree of privileged differentiation is tolerable between regions, languages, and personal status, what in any conflict of rights it means to be subject to more than one rule of law, local and customary, national and statutory. This national history, which is in fact a history of imperialism, hides, distorts, and marginalizes the histories from below, the radical histories of a people who fought against the imposition of these myths, as these myths are a result of ideological propensities to dominate the created other. Mapping radical histories, paying attention to the demands that whatever conceptualization of rights that are agreed upon must be applicable to the humanity of the marginalized, where a peculiar form of philosophy of life was imposed upon those who were already there as well as those forced to be there. The narratives, the discourses of freedom, liberty, justice, rule of law must be stretched beyond their limits through consistent resistance to their disproportionate, limited application and negative impact. The way we engage in this process of mapping must include a liberation of the discourses that are created to expose the false legitimacy of the state in all of its contradictions." Writing in the preface of the re-release of Mau Mau from Within, an analysis of Kenyan's peasant revolt, under a new title, The Mau Mau Within, Story of the Land and Freedom Army, Ngugi wa Thiong'o highlights the importance of the notion from within. According to Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the from within is key to understanding the possibilities of radical histories, as the story of the struggle of the Land and Freedom Army has far too long been written by those without. For Ngugi wa Thiong'o, as has been the consistent purpose of his life's work, there are two categories of those who write without. The first category consists of authors of colonial narratives, i.e. Ian Henderson, The Hunt for Dedan Kimathi, or Carruthers, The Psychology of Mau Mau, who saw the movement and the soldiers for freedom as nothing more than a mumbo-jumbo-ish cult. The selected vocabulary was intended to reinforce this narrative. The second category is that of many African scholars, and even those writing from abroad, who were able to treat Dedan Kimathi and his soldiers and the masses that supported them as constituting a serious anti-colonial struggle. But both categories of scholars, even when in profound disagreement, tend to use the vocabulary of the colonial in talking about the war. Professor Mushiri Mugu, writing in the same new edition, suggests that this expanded edition is very significant, as it is imperative that we spend time examining the larger context against which to view the movement, particularly as Kenya suffers from either a self-imposed amnesia or what she calls systematically imposed socialized amnesia, especially when it comes to remembering the histories of colonial oppression and the resultant heroic efforts by the masses not just to resist, but to overthrow the enemy. This suppression and repression of memory over a people's struggle is a lethal weapon in imperialist psychological warfare. The coercion of forcing oppressed people to forget, replacing the histories from below, results in the erasure of memory. And in this condition, the oppressed become zombies under the manipulation of those who impose the state. Nevertheless, fortunately too, in psychological warfare, there is always a dialectically positioned group of intellectuals whom Walter Rodney described as guerrilla intellectuals, who are essential for the full liberation of a colonized people. This group of intellectuals, due to their function, must also be capable of class suicide. In Kenya today, there is the very real materialization of this principle, captured in a network of organizers, activists, thinkers who are committed to radically restructuring the fundamental relationship of the masses to the structures of the state, to each other, to the environment, their relationship to the world, the African world. Facilitated by a complementary network of social justice centers, this group of organic intellectuals are mapping the radical histories of Kenya using history as a weapon, fueling the formation of a critical Africana consciousness. The logical conclusion points to building a sustained resistance to the intentional imposition of historical amnesia, a weapon of the imperial. Today, we explore radical histories of Kenya and the praxis of liberation with Waringa Wahome. Waringa Wahome is an organizer, political theorist, lawyer, member of Muthoni Social Justice Center, the Communist Party of Kenya, as well as the Kenyan Organic Intellectuals Network. She is also principal organizer of a network that legally supports activists and other organizers who are targets of repressive elements of the state. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program. Thank you for joining us today, Waringa. How are you?
I am doing very well, and thank you for having me.
No problem. I'm really excited about having this conversation with you because this is an initial conversation that I am intentionally trying to develop more substantive continuity in the way that we think about the African world by making sure that we connect with folk on the continent, connect with folk in the communities who are organizing to restructure their particular conditions by using any means necessary, to quote Malcolm, but also using the ways of knowing that were produced in those particular places. And the place that I'm talking about and talking to you about right now, of course, is in and around Nairobi in Kenya. Again, thank you for joining us. And let's just dig right in. Let's just go right into, a conversation. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and also how you begin your path into organizing in and around the communities that you organize.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I said, or like you said, my name is Waringa Wahome. I am a member of the Communist Party of Kenya, and I organize with the Mathare Social Justice Center, which is an informal community-based organization, which documents and writes about the struggles of people in informal settlements, and particularly the places that are most deprived of social justice, of the basic needs that are granted in the Constitution of social justice. We say right to food, we say right to water, we say right to healthcare, we say right to housing, the basic needs, and they're the most deprived of such needs. So organizing in that community, it just gives life and gives hope to see a different world, seeing that we are organizing in the bedrock of imperialism. We're in Kenya, and in Kenya is where so many things have happened historically. We've had the capture of land in Kenya, we've had the killing of so many progressives by our own neo-colonial governments. So the hope for a different world is what moves me, and the hope for just a social just world, one that obeys human rights, one that follows rule of law, we're living in a democratic state where it is not divided in a manner that there are some people that have basic rights and there are others that struggle to even survive. So I think in my work, particularly as a human rights lawyer, social justice advocate, I do these things because I want a different world. So we use the law as a tool to a different world.
So this notion of social justice is a very interesting notion, because one of the things that I try to, kind of disrupt is this idea of qualifiers for justice. Because again, as a human rights lawyer, there is this sense in the context that rights and categorized into different categories based upon a specific individual. How does social justice, as being defined from a structural institutional base, right, as a human rights lawyer, and also how does that either promote or contradict what is happening on the ground in the places that you're organizing? Meaning this, is there a sense of justice that is different than the institutionalized conceptualization of justice from a specific, I would say, Western perspective?
Yes, of course. Of course, there's a different perspective of social justice. But at the same time, particularly organizing in such a capitalist state and a neo-colonial state as this one, there are limitations to these laws. There are limitations to the legal procedures that have been set. One that, of course, are not for the poor. So it's very hard for the poor to access social justice. It's very hard for them to access most of these things. And it's a structural problem. It's systemic and it's structural. And those things we understand. So the importance, particularly of human rights lawyers, is to take the law as it is on paper and bring it to our field of organizing. So the laws that have been provided for in the constitutions, the provisions that we have, those particularly, for example, of our constitution, which is a very progressive constitution. For example, one of our articles, Article 43, the one that provides for social justice. Taking those particular problems that have been provided for and taking them to the heart of struggle. So we take them back to the place we're organizing. We take the law and take it to the people. And the importance of doing this is because, for example, Mathare has a whole problem of land. And the situation of Mathare is a question of land. And it's a question of state suppression. It's a question of annihilation of young people based on poverty. It's about criminalization of poverty. It's about criminalization of healthcare, criminalization of everything that can be termed as a right, or even a social justice desired right for human beings. And such things that we have to organize around. We have to organize around land. We have to use law as a tool to organize around land, to protect public land, to protect community land. And that is the only easiest way that we can take the law to the heart of the struggle, taking the law from the documents, taking the law from theory, and at least organizing it and using it to organize for our practice.
So what are some of the ways that you have been able to use that? It would be interesting to look at some of the actual practical material aspects of organizing, and particularly land. And your point about land is essential. And of course, we know land is essential in the history of radical and revolutionary organizing in Kenya as well. Could you talk about the use of land as a fundamental component in liberation, in justice, in understanding the history of radical organizing in Kenya?
Yes, of course. Mathare has always been a hub for anti-colonial organizing, since we can trace all this historically. And the struggle of Mathare can be traced all the way back to when Mau Mau, which were the freedom fighters of our country, were organizing in Mathare. It's a working class base that houses working class and the most deprived in society, which forces them to organize against their conditions. So we have during the colonial times when Mau Mau was organizing against colonialism, they used Mathare as a hub. And now the development of the struggle has gotten to a point where now we're organizing for social justice. Now we're organizing towards, it's quite similar, the struggles are quite similar, because Mau Mau's actual name was Kenya Land and Freedom Army. So what they were fighting for was land. And the question was land, because they had been chased away from their lands, because most of the people and the occupants of Mathare are people who came from other lands. Reading the history of Kenya and during colonial times, the first thing that the white settlers did, as a form of suppression at least, was acquire the best of lands, what they called white highlands. So they acquired the white highlands, and then they had to push the natives, who are the residents of Kenya or Kenyans at the time. They had to be pushed out of their land so that the white people can occupy very vast pieces of land. So the resultant of the same is that they go to the other side and they come and live in Mathare, cramped up in Mathare, and they're the ones who are the mortals, the working class of the city. And their struggle was for land. And when they were organizing for land. And at that time, even when SAR, Evelyn Baling, gave the state of emergency sometime around 1882, 1881, sometime around there. What he did is that, what happened is that there were fires all over Mathare to chase those people away, because it's a hub for anti-colonial organizing. And now moving forward to a point where the struggle has developed to a point where today it reflects very similar situations. So it's now it's a struggle for social justice. And it's similarly, land is also another big question, because the way people are cramped up, the population of close to like 1.7 kilometers square is housing close to 500,000 people, because Mathare houses almost 500,000 people in such a small space. So people are cramped up completely, and it's just violent conditions all over. And at the same time, we have people who have very large pieces of land that lie idle. They're not developed, they're not agriculturally developed, they're not industrialized, they're not doing anything. So nonetheless, it's still a class struggle. And now that people are organizing for social justice, we are organizing so that we can have our land back. Because when people have land, they have ownership, they have sovereignty. And if sovereignty of the people is to come, the people must own the land. And now as we continue to fight for social justice, as we continue to fight for land, even we're involved in activities such as marches that we've done. We've done marches to protect public land. We've involved ourselves in cases that are fighting for land that has been grabbed by some greedy people, land that people want to privatize that belongs to the community. Such land we need to protect, and we need all measures possible so that we can protect that land.
And also with the efforts of folk at the grassroots level who are very concerned with the ecological damage that climate change is producing. So now you have, close to 500,000 people in a particular place for a particular reason, because let's talk about a little bit of the history of the area that you're talking about as well, because you mentioned it, but why were people put there in the first place? Because this is a colonial system. It's a colonial system that moves, housing people and keeping people in a particular area because they are considered to be a threat. However, they need to exploit their labor, right? So talk a little bit about that in the context of the social justice centers that develop, because you laid out a little bit of the history that goes back to the Land and Freedom Army, but also, and this being one of the hubs, talk about how this particular place was established. It's a place where you marginalize, but yet you need their labor. There's a constant super exploitation that is happening here. Talk a little bit about that and how the development of the center really is developed out of these movements that have been moving over the course of years. And then the center is that institutional hub, that vanguard for a lot of the movements. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you trace it, as you are saying, to anti-colonial struggles, and if we move forward to the involvement that has had Mathare being one place that has anchored anti-colonial, neo-colonial struggle and the poverty of just society. And Mathare itself, or Mathare Social Justice Center, is organized around the struggles. People are just forced by conditions to organize around the struggle for social justice. Because if you go back to the history of when it came to be, Mathare was used as a quarry. It was the outskirts of the city. So it was a quarry where it provided the workers, number one, for the city of Nairobi. Most of the buildings that are constructed in Nairobi, in Muthaiga, which is an adjacent bourgeois society, And the other place, which is Pangani, which is another middle class kind of has a middle class kind of setup. And then we have Nairobi. So most of the workers came from most of them came from Mathare, and most of the sponsors also came from Mathare. So the level of exploitation among the workers of Mathare, like I said, Mathare is a settlement which has housed the working class and the most deprived of society, which are considered the lumpen proletarians. So the working class in Mathare, who are the ones who are doing the constructions, who are the ones now, it is filled with most of the people who are doing domestic work. And of course, in our society doesn't regard domestic work as work. So most of domestic work does not even receive labor rights, and they don't even have any recognition in terms of labor rights. So in terms of payment, they hardly receive any payment that is substantive for the labor that they do. When it comes to questions of, most of them come out and they're paid for, because most of the work that they do is domestic work of cleaning clothes. They wash houses, they wash dishes and whatnot, they cook for the children. That, in such kind of society, in such kind of humiliating conditions, and the payment is so disgustingly low, because most of them will be paid amounts going around 200 shillings, and they need less than, they can hardly survive with such small amounts. So it's just an oppressive and extractive state. Because it's just an extractive, it's a capitalist state. We're living in a capitalist society, which means the workers continue to be exploited. There is no regard for what they do. And Mathare houses such kind of society, and it houses the most depraved of society, I insist.
With most movements, there must be an ideological foundation, a guide in the work that one is doing in order to be clear about the objectives that one is attempting to seek. Could you talk a little bit about the ideological or the theoretical that is being informed both by the work as well? So there are material conditions. You're clearly dealing with some, I don't want us to be, dismissive of the material conditions but I think it's important to talk about how one is developing or how one develops their practice based upon study and struggle. So what are some of those things that you guys are doing to really political education? How are you organizing, people to understand and to become critically conscious of their super exploitation in these particular areas?
One of the anchors and the pillars of Mathare Social Justice Center is documenting of extrajudicial killings, because it's very prevalent where we have policemen. What I saw the post previously by the Director of Criminal Investigation, which is very audaciously stating that what they're doing is annihilating groups. So it is just cleansing of young people and criminalizing their poverty. And at the same time, social justice centers just around the world, they emerge as a reaction, or at least as an organizing base to organize against such oppression. So Mathare, at MSJC, there's documentation of extrajudicial killings, that the people can stop normalizing such. Political education is very keen in this case, because class struggle is driving forward. It's prevalent in our society, where so many people are living in such terrible conditions, and political education comes in this point so that it can politicize and conscientize people against this kind of systemic killings, against this kind of the systemic poverty. And through political education, there is organic intellectual, for example, with a militant group or militant method of organizing, where within the social justice movement, there's now critical thinkers of the movement who are forming themselves within organic intellectuals, who are reading the theory of Marxism, who are reading, understanding how Marxism works, because they get to understand how the state operates. They get to understand the political economy of our country. And along the way, so now it's easy to demystify that kind of information to the masses, because until their consciousness gets to that point where they cannot normalize these injustices any longer. They cannot normalize poverty any longer. They cannot normalize the lack of basic resources, because people will continue saying that such is life, but that such is not life. It is systemic lack, and the only reason we don't have most of these things is systemic. So now political education is what we do, and organizing marches, organizing campaigns in such kind of manner, because campaigns also are important. For example, previously we did a march on lower food prices, because food prices have gotten to a point that people can hardly afford to eat. People are dying of poverty. So we organize marches in the community or with the community, to organize around such matters, because those are things that affect them and those are things that they so easily relate to. So connecting why is it that we don't have food to the systemic connection with the state, because food prices will continue to go up as long as we're in a neoliberal economy. Food prices will continue to go up, housing will continue, the capitalism crisis will continue to show itself all over. And now demystifying that information to the masses, now we talk together in conversation, through dialogues, through campaigns, through all forms of organizing that we can use that at least within our disposal.
No, and that's very important, because interestingly enough, that this pandemic has been able to do was to actually cause a lot of people to slow down, but also to make more connections, make more opportunity for us to be able to have transnational organize, right? How important is internationalism? How important is Black internationalism or a Pan-Africanism? Or how important is it for us to understand in an African context, in an African world context, that the international solidarity, not just in what I would call non-substantive solidarity, but real solidarity with the efforts that folk are engaged in, particularly in the communities that we're bringing to the audience today, and that you're organizing with. How important is internationalism to the question of class struggle in Africa? And how does that relate? I guess we can have a conversation of how does that relate to an understanding of class struggle in other parts of the world?
I think I'll start with that one on the pandemic, because if anything, that the pandemic was, I wouldn't say good, but it made clear so many things. It made clear how the state is so disengaged with the lived realities of its people. Because with the curfews that were enforced, with the measures that were enforced, they were so disengaged from what was going on in the lives of the people. Because in most informal societies, in Madare, in Dandora, in Kibera, in all those societies, people are cramped up, number one. So of course you cannot tell them to distance or space or whatever. And when you tell them not to work or to work from home or to go to do whatever, the jobs that they do, most of them are casual laborers. So to tell them to work from home is to tell them, not to work. And not to work is not to live. So it's condemning them to die, and it's condemning them to more poverty. And if anything, in such a repressive state, the only thing it promotes is a culture of silence and poverty. Because people will continue to be silent and people will continue to be poor. And the importance of going on organizing against such state repression, and the importance of continue to organizing for our land and freedom is through conversations such as this ones. We get to amplify those conversations. We get to have connections of people knowing what is going on in our societies. And I think the internet has made that so simple, because now we're able to relate, for example, with the struggle of Palestine. We're able to relate with the struggle of the Kurdish movement. We're able to relate with so many people that are struggling against neocolonialism. There's the war, the imperialist war going on with Ukraine and with Russia and the USA. And if we do not amplify this, if South Africa doesn't stand with the struggles of Ukraine and the struggles of Palestine and the struggles of the workers in Kenya, the workers in Russia, the workers in the USA, the workers everywhere, if we're not familiar with each other's struggles, and if we continue, the state has worked very well, because the state is so dedicated and it's so well structured within itself, because they have police, they have prisons, they have so many things that they can use against us. They have a whole armed body, bodies of armed men. So they have a lot to organize against workers. But again, we insist, like Karl Marx, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So internationalism is important, because as long as the whole world is standing with the struggles of one country, and as long as we are all standing with the struggle of workers, this struggle we shall win.
And that's a very important point, because one of the things that I wanted to tease out in your conversation was the exacerbation of these aggressive COVID measures. But also when you're talking about people being able to survive, This had a very, very deep impact on the informal economy, what is considered to be the informal economy, which I don't like that term because the idea...
It's actually unemployment.
Right. Talk more about that.
When you tell people that there's an informal sector, that is just unemployment. Because if you're going to call someone who sells clothes on the streets that they're doing informal business, and when it rains after 20 minutes, they don't have a job in. If you tell someone who sells anything on the streets and, they're exposed to any environmental condition, if it rains, just a slight change will affect their business. Just a slight change will affect their survival. That is not an informal sector. They're just unemployed people. So the government, capitalism creates them. It just has a way of creating, I don't know what that bandage is. It's some form of bandage because it's a big wound. But now we're placing bandages and calling them, it's like the way we say middle class. That's just a surviving strata of society. There's no middle class. Most of them are surviving with debt and loans from banks. So if banks or the financial sector was to collapse, even they themselves would not be in survival. So even the informal settlements, informal sector itself, it's just a beautiful word for unemployment, because instead of creating a society where people can grow their intellect, can instead of industrializing so that people can have employment, instead of just developing society along with the needs of the people have to, they tell themselves, we have to survive, we have to find something to eat. And it's very little money that you get. And most of the people that even do this informal sector work, they're hardly living in any better conditions. Even they themselves are the ones that are most lumpenized. So, it's just a bandage in a very big wound, and it hardly stops the bleeding.
I mean, and that's a very important point, because again, I like I said, that term of informal economies, it's like you said, it's just a beautiful word for some ugly conditions. Let's talk about, the role of young folk, but also the role of women in organizing, particularly right now. There's a tradition, those who understand, the anti-colonial struggle in East Africa, but in particular Kenya, know that women, had a very important role. What is the role or the vanguard, as to speak, of folk who are organizing in this particular moment?
So we have women in social justice centers, which is a pillar of the social justice movement, which is organizing women. And also, women are the most, because criminalization of men, or young men particularly, is mostly affecting women. Because if young people or young men are killed because of their involvement in gangs, most of them are just recently married. Most of them are just, or most of them have kids and families. So now there's organized a group of mothers of victims of extrajudicial killings. So these organizations are very important when it comes to conscientizing, particularly women. And there's a conversation between Lenin and Clara Zetkins on the role of having a separate women's movement, or separate women wings within a movement that is now a separate women wing within the party. But in this particular, we never said a separate women's wing within the movement. So the purpose of this is to organize women, and to organize women within their common struggles, because women have, they're already living in an oppressive state, going through double exploitation, because they're exploited as workers, and then they have exploitation because of their own gender. Just yesterday we came from International Women's Day, and the problem with that is that it has become commodified by such a capitalist society, because now it's no longer a conversation for struggle for socialism. Now it's just bourgeois feminism, which has nothing to do with the struggles of workers and the struggle of women. So having a women wing within the social justice movement, and having women organizing themselves as victims of extrajudicial killings, and understanding that that extrajudicial killings do not occur because their sons are thieves, or their sons are criminals, or their sons are whatever name that has been, they've been given so many bad names, of giving a dog a bad name so that you can kill it. They've been given so many bad names. They're gangsters, they're thieves, they're criminals. And when their kids are killed in those particular circumstances, they understand that they're not killed because of that. They're killed because of criminalization of poverty. and being in a movement that is organizing against against state suppression, against extrajudicial killings, against land injustices, against environmental injustices, against injustices on women, organizing around the same and conscientizing women and telling them that, or at least learning together and teaching that it is not, it is a struggle towards socialism, and it is only in socialism that we can have the true liberation of women. It is organizing women within the movement and outside of the movement, organizing our communities and learning together that this is a struggle for social justice. It's a struggle for freedom, and it's a class struggle. It's beyond gender. While we continue to fight for women's rights, while we continue to advocate against injustices against women, while we continue to advocate against everything that is going on with women. The other day we had in our society where a woman was stripped almost naked by a group of like 20 men and no one is doing, such kind of things. Of course, we continue to advocate against, we continue to speak out, and we continue to spread the agenda, but one that is clear, that the class struggle is the primary contradiction. And when we fight for gender, we are fighting for it so that we understand that it is only under socialism that we can attain true.
And it's a very important point because again, it's what are we struggling for? We're struggling using these mechanisms and these tools and these concepts in order to move beyond the conditions that are being exploited, that are being used to be exploited, whether it's gender, whether it's class. These particular components become important. Let's talk a little bit. I got two more things I definitely wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the Communist Party in the context of Kenya and organizing. And that will lead us into really organizing in this political context in Kenya itself, because it is definitely opportunity, but repression is big. So how do we understand, get us an understanding that what is happening in Kenya, the turn towards this ultra nationalist, these notions, and also the fact that there are leaders who are jumping on board with some of the ultra imperialist tendencies that are happening right around Russia, Ukraine, coming out of Kenya. What is important? Let's talk a little bit about, the history of the Communist Party and organizing in Kenya. And let's lead that up to what are the conditions that are being addressed in this political climate as we're moving towards elections and, these types of things as well.
I think at this point, I will go back to radical organizing because we cannot talk about radical organizing without talking about Pio Gama Pinto. Because Pio Gama Pinto was the first political assassin. He was the first political, assassination? And I think, Pio having been one who used to organize with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau, to bring them arms and document for them and write so many documents for them. He was an Asian Kenyan Goan who will easily bypass most of this British colonialist police. So they would hardly know it is because he was Asian, and he would be able to pass through Mathare on Mau Mau Road and get the arms to the Mau Mau who were in Mathare at the time. So as that was during Jomo Kenyatta's regime, the first stretch of neo-colonial contact. When he continued to organize against it, now we have people like J.M. Kariuki, who was also killed at the time by the past president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. Continued suppression that we continue to see, continued state suppression as we continue to see in the executions at the time. And then moving forward, we have the Moi regime, which was brutally silencing any dissident voice that tried to come out and fight against them, and the promoting of neoliberal economy that they were continuing to cement in our country and taking over with them, with the colonial construct that we had similarly. They were using the same tactics that the colonialists were using, mass incarcerations. They were using the same tactics. They were killing people, they were, however, they were advancing they attacked. And then we move forward, at that period, he even started Nyayo chambers. Nyayo chambers were used to torture the academics at the time, the intellectuals who were writing against what he was doing. It was most of the university staff that were organizing students. Most of the students that had taken up organizing within most of the universities that were organizing against the suppression that was going within the Moi regime. And then moving forward, we have taking over, and it is back that thing, annihilation of young poor. Huru, we also saw the same with Huru. We also saw the same thing because even he was even with the ICC for ethnic cleansing of just ethnic violence with the 2008, 2007, 2008 elections. And as we move forward, the one thing that we see most is that the state continues to find other means to suppress people. And when it comes to organizing, they continue to make it so difficult. They continue tightening the chain so hard that it becomes so difficult for people to organize. And we have things like how they used the pandemic to prevent organizing, and how they took advantage of the pandemic to do their political fallacy games that they were playing around. And you see, advancing the same, we have things that they're doing now, because most of the spaces that were used for social organizing, particularly places like parks and open spaces that were used to organize by most of the opposing forces, and most of the opposers stood against a neo-colonial state. And we have, for example, now they're doing illegal and unconstitutional constructions on the lands. They're taking away open spaces. They've been recorded they've been seen cutting down trees so that they can, create a whole route that it's a new development that has nothing to do with people. And they find ways to continue suppressing organizing, completely suppressing organizing. Because as long as people are not organizing, they're not a threat to the state. And as long as we continue organizing against such kind of things, and we continue organizing that we do not, we've seen, for example, as social movements continue to develop, before we got to Mathare social justice centers, as people continue to fight for the struggle for social justice, as we continue to organize around matters of social justice, it's that people started organizing through people's parliaments. We had Bunge la Mwananchi, for example, which our coordinator Gasheke Gashi, he was part of, or at least was one of the founding members of Bunge la Mwananchi. And then Bunge la Mwananchi was a people's parliament, which people would discuss and organize. And in the space that they used to organize in, which was Chivanchi Gardens within the heart of Nairobi, now it has been beautified in a manner that people can no longer organize and talk about politics. Now there is grass that you can't step on, and then you have to walk on paved ways. It's beautification just meant to suppress organizing. And then moving forward, and then now Bunge la Mwananchi now diversified to have the first social justice center, which was Mathare social justice centers. And as the blooming of other social justice centers came up, now people started being aware of, or at least conscious of the state suppression, and they started being conscious of capitalism, not conscious of that it's capitalism, but conscious of the crisis of capitalism. People started seeing the exploitation of labor. Now people are talking about it, even if not talking about it in a conscious manner. But as long as workers continue to be brought together in the urban settlements, they continue to just raise each other's consciousness and these kind of things, because they can be able to look at the conditions and see that the conditions are different. So as we continue to organizing, of course, there comes up to a point where, after the emergence of social movements, now there has to be militant organizing. So now militant organizing now pushes forward to where we have to look for progressive political parties, which come now to act as a vanguard to these social movements, because now social movements particularly, and of course being that the aim is to get political power, social movements cannot get political power because they're not registered political parties. So now social movements, they have a vanguard, or they have progressive political parties that now move their agendas and that they can participate in these bourgeois elections. They can participate in elections, they can win positions to bring reforms and organize, teach people, and continue using elections, not particularly to win, but to continue organizing. That's why we see the birth of a party like the Communist Party of Kenya, which was officially registered as the Communist Party of Kenya in 2019, in a whole struggle, because even the registrar of political parties had refused to register the party. And as we continue to organize, even within the political parties, and we see Communist Party of Kenya, which is clear on its stand and it's clear on its position that we're struggling for, or we're fighting for socialism, and our struggle is one struggle for socialism and ultimately communism. And it's bringing out the same through its campaigns and agitations. Events like Sabasaba, coming out to the streets and telling the state, with fully branded shirts of and flags like the one I have right behind me, because they're audacious in saying that, the party of the workers is here and they have to organize. And, it's just a reaction against it. And so the party comes up and continues to organize within such societies. Yes.
Wonderful. And I would be remiss to not make the connection, particularly with radical organizing, historically here in the United States. Of course, we have, El Haj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, who actually knew up until, and also used to say consistently that we needed a Mau Mau movement. Of course, Land and Freedom Army is the correct name, but we need a Land and Freedom Army movement here in the United States among Black folks. So, the connections are very sharp and they're very...
Actually assassinated 6 days prior. They had met here in Kenya and had those exchanges, and then they were killed around the same time. And it was about the document in Kenya on the sessional paper number 10, which was promoting capitalism and promoting a neoliberal economy in our country, which is now in practice. It is now the document in practice.
No. Speak of just to be clear about that, the assassination. Just to be clear, I just want to make sure that we repeat that for our listeners. You mentioned the paper. Talk a little bit more about that paper, because this point is a very important point. The assassination of the meet. When they meet. But I wanted to kind of really, really highlight that point about the about them being assassinated after meeting very closely apart. But also, you mentioned the paper about, could you talk a little bit about that assassination? You mentioned it when you were talking about this history of radical organizing that led up to, of course, the Communist Party even today. But yeah, talk a little bit about, because that's a very important point. The continuities with radical organizing in Kenya, but also here in the United States, it's very important. El Haj Malik Shabazz is very clear about understanding revolutionary and radical politics and radical organizing. In the midst of all of this, we have Didan Kamathi, who is organizing as well.
Yes. At that time, when we're talking about PU, there was a document which was a facade of a labeling, because they call it African socialism. But it's anything but African socialism. And, when they were calling it African socialism, whatever ideology they were basing it on was just creating a capitalist document and then, labeling it African socialism. They were calling it, when we even talk about, that's a whole different conversation. We talk about African socialism or socialist Africa. But on the document itself, sessional paper number 10, the document was one that cemented a neoliberal economy. They were talking about privatization of land. They were talking about borrowing and financial and foreign aid, and why we need foreign aid to develop, and why Kenya needs to develop so fast. And so to develop so fast, they need to borrow, and they need connection with this imperialist state. So it's just a colonial state cementing themselves on our country. And now we had a group of members of political parties. And at the time, of course, because PO used to organize within a party, he was also a member of parliament. And, being that he was a member of parliament, he's organized other members of parliament who were being mocked by imperialist stooges in our country at the time, being called Seven Bearded Sisters. It was very humiliating. It's a very terrible name if you call men Seven Bearded Sisters, because they're fighting against you. So they were labeled Seven Bearded Sisters because they're the ones who used to organize against that document. And they were creating another document that now was creating for a socialist country. But this another one is just a capitalist document. In fact, it had been created by the CIA and then sent to Kenya through one of the people that now Kenya considered as progressive was not. T.J. Mboya, Thomas Joseph Mboya. The document itself was CIA written and then imposed on us through Tom Mboya. And because PO is organizing against that, and Malcolm has come to visit and exchange notes about it. And just one that was intended to cement imperialism and to cement a neoliberal economy. Asking for privatization of land, asking for foreign aid, asking for dependency on more developed quote end of quote countries. And PO was now organizing a counterdote, with what I referred previously as the name that was referred to them as the Seven Bearded Sisters, members of parliament who were organizing against. We had people like Oginga Odinga, organizing against the document that was being brought, and they were organizing the members of parliament so that they can have a counter document that actually promoted for a socialist country and a more democratic country, that is. And the more these people continue to organize, and they continue to gain popularity among the members of parliament in Kenya, and as they continue to gain popularity among those members of parliament, of course, PINPO was now considered as a threat. a threat to the country and a threat to such imperialist powers. And of course, according to them, because they cannot promote freedom and democracy, genuine freedom and democracy, they cannot allow people to have land because that will continue to develop. And they had to assassinate him. And, we have Malcolm, who is one who is now promoting nationalism and is now organizing within the class struggle, conscious of the class struggle and the spirit of internationalism. And, having such organizing against imperialist powers, they're going to see you as a threat. And they needed to get rid of both people. And now there is one organizing within the home of imperialism, which is the USA, and then we have PO organizing in the backyard of imperialism, which is Kenya. Of course they have to of course they were to be assassinated because they have to let the struggle down. But like we always say, that if the blood of a revolutionary is shed, the only thing it does is bring up more revolutionaries because it will continue to bloom.
No, absolutely. And as we come to a pause, and I don't want to say a close, because again, this is just one of the initial conversations and contacts that, Africa Will Now Project and a lot of the formations that I am involved in will be in, real substantive camaraderie with the organizing that is happening on the ground. How can people really have not an understanding, because this is what we're doing here, but how can people be involved? How can people support the work that is being done, that you're involved in, and the formations that you're involved with? How can people really have some substantive support to the work that's being done?
It's a struggle against its oppression. It's a struggle for socialism at the same time. And, the media has played a particular role. One that is a bourgeois, particularly supporting a bourgeois society. Because the media will not report most of the things that go on in our societies. You will not find the media reporting, for example, the march that was done on lower food prices. They cannot report on marches like those ones. You will not find the media reporting on documents or marches against extrajudicial killings, and they will not even report on extrajudicial killings. In fact, the media is the one that is going to be so key on promoting criminalization of young people. So even getting the information out, genuine information out, documenting of the actual struggle and creating it in such an international space, it cannot be denied that people can no longer normalize such matters. There's a need to amplify conversations on the struggle for social justice internationally. There's an importance for us to keep these conversations going, for example. There's a need to amplify this conversation. There's a need to find an alternative or progressive form of reporting, And international media plays a very big role. In particular, there are some progressive international medias that, international reporting stations of sorts that are coming up or that are uprising. And, that would be so important because in such matters, they would be able to amplify conversations on such matters. They'll be able to speak about the struggle for social justice. They'd be able to show the disregard for rule of law. They'd be able to show, how suppressive the state is or how extractive the capitalist state that we're living in is. And at the same time, there's a lot of solidarity that is needed, international solidarity, as we are now in solidarity with the struggle for Palestine, for the freedom of Palestine, as we are now with the struggle for the Kurdish women and the Kurdish movement, as we say that, freedom has, freedom for Ocalan, for example. And as we continue to amplify all this, there is need for solidarity, international solidarity for the workers and for all the brave people of society as we amplify this conversation on social justice. And at the same time, we have the Legal Empowerment Network, for example, which I coordinate. The Legal Empowerment Network itself, through filing cases in court. There's a whole problem with the judicial system, and the people need to have their very own empowerment within the law. People need to organize with the law. And such matters are the things that we can lay basis on, because in circumstances where people, human rights defenders, for example, are living in fear of their own security. We need to have a structured system where they can be able to be sure that in the event of arrest, in such a manner where the state is suppressing them and suppressing their organizing and their voices, they have to understand that they maybe have a place where they can fight for themselves. They're sure they can be able, if they're arrested, they will be able to come out. We have, in terms of other forms of support, financial form of support, for example, in circumstances where people have been arrested and they need to be bailed out. We have many circumstances where we've gone for marches in town, for example, within Nairobi city, and people have been arrested, by the police. And in such matters, there is need for a form of, financial solidarity in such cases. So having a kitty or a fund of sort within the legal empowerment network that will be easily bail out people or human rights defenders who are continuing with their work, just structured in a manner that continues to amplify and fight for social justice. And at the same time, there is support for the campaigns that are done. For example, in Mathare Social Justice Center, we have campaign against extrajudicial killings. We have Art for Social Justice, the one you were previously speaking about. When you come to Kenya, you must visit Mathare, so that you can see around and what Arts for Social Justice is doing, for example. It's doing massive work. Art in itself is meant to make even the revolution seem irresistible or be irresistible, because it easily conscientizes people, because people can relate, for example, in a mural of Thomas Sankara, and it's easy to relate with the struggle that Thomas Sankara was fighting for through art. There is music that people are doing, or at least continuing to record and struggle records of very progressive music, that records of the struggles of informal settlements and the struggles of poverty and the struggles of workers. And of course, when we talk about, for example, these many different platforms where people can write, reflect on the struggles going on in their different countries. And if it's the USA, they're reflecting on the struggles so that we can see the similarity of the struggles within. It's capitalism. Capitalism has very similar struggles, although different conditions. If it's state repression, if it's poverty, if it's homelessness, if it's land, if it's how expensive the state of being is continuing to become, if it's a crisis in the healthcare sector, if it's a crisis in the housing sector, it's broad. Although the conditions in the USA or wherever are different from the ones in Kenya, the struggles are quite similar. So, reflecting on the same even promotes the spirit of internationalism, because we get to see that workers, it's a similar struggle for workers. So, as we continue, even international platforms, national platforms, as long as we're all amplifying the struggle for social justice, then we continue to be strong, and we continue to cement a struggle that we for sure shall win. And, of course, we have parties like the Communist Party of Kenya, and it's a party that is, it's continuing to ground its cadres. And it's just a party that is organizing within even schools. Because, for example, I don't know, there are some videos that you can see on YouTube on debates that it is that they're holding with students, on the viability of communism and communism in Kenya and what is communism. Because, it's a process of conscientizing the masses. It's at any form of political education that we can use so that masses can get conscious and as we continue this struggle. Yes.
No, and that's a great way to put a pin in our conversation again. So, again, we will continue this. And one of the things that as you were talking, are providing very, very important points is one of the things that we do know in the context of the Black world at one particular point in time was a robust Black press that had an international lens. And so a lot of times we think that we have to reinvent the wheel, but in actuality, sometimes we just have to pick it back up and dust it off. We have different means now, but no, thank you for taking the time to start this journey with us. You're initiating, a number of things that we're going to be, in further conversation with. But as before we go, I wanted to make sure I give you another opportunity to leave us with some closing thoughts, or we can, again, we could put a pin in it and come back.
The only thing we have to fight is a culture of silence and poverty. We used to say it's a culture of fear and silence, but now we are beyond the fear, because some things, like Chair used to say, some things are beyond fear. Even if you're afraid about something, it doesn't stop you from doing it. So now we're fighting against the culture of silence and poverty. And as we continue to advance the conversation on when silence is a tactic and when silence should just not be used, we have to fight against that. And if you're going to fight against silence and poverty, we have to be clear on what we're fighting about. And if we're fighting for something, we're fighting for socialism. And the struggle is a struggle to attain socialism, a struggle to attain a democratic state, a struggle to attain freedom and land for our people. And everyone, like Pio used to say, until everyone is free. And he would say that freedom freedom has to be freedom for the masses, freedom from exploitation, freedom from poverty, freedom from hopelessness. It has to be freedom for the masses. And we have to continue. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of political education. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of conscientizing the masses, but we shall continue to be strong. And as long as we're in solidarity with each other, as long as, all of us comrades are aware that in the life of comrades, there is loyalty and there is truth. So it's an international struggle. So comrades living in truth and in loyalty as we continue with this struggle. And we must fight. And this struggle we shall win. It's a struggle and we must win.
Thank you very much again for spending the time. We will be in touch soon.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Okay. Damn. I wanna show you what heaven looks like. I wanna show you what heaven looks like, 'cause I've seen it.
That's it for Africa Woke Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africawokenowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa Woke Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa Woke Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa Woke Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Watterson, technology advisor it's Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa Woke Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa Woke Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.